Hello, this is Adam from Sandman here from Inflectra. Welcome to today's webinar on project baselining in Spira. In this webinar today, we're going to be talking about baselining. First of all, what actually is baselining? Then we'll look at the new features we added this year in both Spira Team and Spira Plan that provide you baselining functionality. I'll also be giving you a little bit of hints about where we'll be going as well in the future with this functionality. And then I'll be moving into a live application demo in the application. As always, we will have Q&A after the demo. Please write your questions in the Q&A window inside of GoToWebinar, and I will get to them at the end. This presentation probably should take about 20-25 minutes or so, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So again, thanks so much for joining. We will be recording this session, and a copy of the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. So with that, I'm going to just turn off my camera, and we're going to focus on the content. Okay, so first of all, what is baselining? So baselining, this is a dictionary definition, it's really a collection of versions of a system that are frozen in time. So the idea is that you have requirements and test cases, and although we will be focusing in our discussions on requirements and test cases to a large degree, within Spira and within the system, we consider a baseline to be all artifacts in the product. So it's not just requirements and test cases, although that is kind of, I think, a focus when people talk about baselining. They're often talking about specifically requirements and test cases, and I'll be using that in my example. But what I'm going to show you is actually for us entirely across the system. It affects all the artifacts. So baselines are a way to take a snapshot of the system, what we call a baseline, or a snapshot sometimes, and being able to freeze the system at that point and be able to then compare how requirements and test cases and other artifacts have changed over time. And so you can see at these different key points, what has changed, what is the impacts, and that way you can continue to evolve a system and change the system, but you don't have to necessarily lose that ability to see what it looked like at a given point in time. Now, it's similar and it builds upon what we would call artifact version history. So if you remember in Spira, you can always go to a test case requirement or a defect, and you can look at the history tab, and we'll show you that in a minute, and you can actually see the history of all the changes that are made. But a baseline is a bit more sophisticated than just simple history. And in case you're wondering, I am going to focus on Spira Team and Spira Plan. Baselining is not available in Spira Test. So if you are a Spira Test customer, that's okay. You still have version history, but you don't get baselining. You'll need to upgrade to Spira Team or Spira Plan to get this baselining functionality. So traditionally, a baseline is effectively an extension on what would be artifact history. So if you have a requirement, let's say this is one of the requirements here. If you look closely, it's the default screen background color shall be gray, and you might have a test case that was the test for that particular screen color. So the artifact history would be if you were to change that requirement, maybe you change the color from gray to silver, for example, that's a valid change. That's a change on the attribute, then that requirement will change and there'll be a history record. But suppose you change a bunch of other requirements at the same time. Well, in traditionally without baselining, those are all independent changes. Each of those requirements has changed. You may change the test cases independently as well. All of those artifacts will have their own history, but there's nothing connecting them. A baseline is when you take all the changes made to a set of artifacts, and it could be both all these 4 requirements, and if you look on the diagram to the right, for a true baseline, it needs to need not just the requirements and not just the test cases, but it needs to be all of them. And we call that a baseline or a baseline set. And that allows us to track not just the changes made to individual requirements, but any change made to any requirement or test case and the relationships that go with them. So that's another important aspect. When we talk about artifact history, if I change the priority of a requirement or I change the text of a requirement, that's a field change or a content change. If I was to add a test case from a requirement and remove a test case from a requirement, that's a relationship change inside of Spira Test and inside of Spira older versions. If you make that kind of change, there's no history. So that means if you look down the road and you say, well, okay, we've changed this requirement, we've changed this test case, we've added a test case to it, how has the system changed from version 1 to version 2? Without that relationship change, you're missing key information. And especially in more regulated industries where you have to be able to show compliance, it's really important that you know that not only does this test case cover this requirement, but this test case has always covered this requirement. Or if it hasn't, when did that test case start covering that requirement? Or if the requirement changed so the test case no longer applies and you remove the relationship, when did that happen? So that's an important distinction, is that it's not just about the fields changing, but it's about when did relationships change and having a history of that. And so inside of Spira, we have in version 6.6 and 6.61, which are the latest versions now, they provide you with this more rich baseline functionality where you can track groups of artifacts changing and you can track relationship changes as well as field changes. So what do we have in Spira 6.6 and 6.6.1 really? Well, the first thing is you'll have to do, and we'll show you this all live in the application, is you do have to enable baselining for a product. Every single product in Spira has the option now to have baselining enabled or disabled. And you might ask me, well, why would you ever disable it? Well, there's actually some reasons. The first reason is performance. If you turn on baselining, we're now tracking a lot more information. We're tracking not just the history of field changes, we're tracking relationship changes. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, we're also adding support for tracking position changes. So if I reorder the test steps in a test case, or the steps in a requirement, or the mitigations in a risk, for example, any of those changes will now be tracked as history. So that's a lot more tracking. Well, every time you track something, you've got to store that and do that and retrieve it. So it does impact performance. So if you don't need baseline, you shouldn't turn it on because it will slow the system down. It also increases the amount of data we're storing. So for cloud customers, that's not really a problem. For on-premise customers, that's more data to be stored and managed in versions and so on. And so it is a feature you turn on per product. Also, you might not want that information because it might be something that is private information. Maybe you don't want to have that tracked. So there's some other maybe compliance reasons why you have it turned off on certain projects. It's up to you, but it is a feature you have to enable. Then the way that works in Spira is all of the baselines that you create are tagged with a release. And so this is done because we need a place to be able to find the baselines, and it made sense to be able to tie them to the release or sprint artifact. Because at the beginning of a release or a sprint, you might typically want to freeze the system, track all the changes made from that point onwards until the end of that release. And then when the release is over or the sprint is over in that release, you want to track how the system has changed between those two given points in time. And so that way, at the end of each sprint or each release, instead of just having this is the way the system is, you can now look back and say, okay, well, from sprint 1 to sprint 2, did we add any requirements? Did we remove any requirements? We've done the sprint faster than we thought. Well, is it the same sprint? Well, if you've taken stories out of the sprint, guess what? It's not really the same. So that would explain why your schedule is different. So it can be very useful from a combination of reasons. It could be for schedule tracking, scope tracking with clients, or for compliance to be able to see what is the impact of these changes we've made. So it's really important from a reporting standpoint. So really, again, any users can you turn it on, but ultimately it is captured at the release level and sprint level. And then once you've got baselining turned on, as well as seeing it in each individual release, in the administration section, there is a master place where you can see all of the sorry, the questions are coming up. I'll take that later. So all of the releases and all of the baselines are visible in a central place at the product admin level. So end users will see in the release section all the baselines, but an administrator of the product, a product administrator level user, they can come in and they can see all of the baselines for all of the releases in the product. When they go to see all the baselines, they can see them right here. They can see which release it's a part of. You can filter it by the release. You can filter it by date. You can order it by those things as well, so you can see it in date order. Once you click on a baseline, it will show you for each baseline what are the properties of the baseline itself. So when was the baseline created? What's the previous baseline? And that's really important because the key behind all of this is the change ID. The change ID is our unique history ID across the entire system. And if you're used to the history in Spira, you'll be familiar with that. That's the incrementing ID that captures every single change made to any artifact in the system. And that's already been in the system for a while, but we're now using it. We're now tagging it, these snapshots, these baselines to that change ID. So from a version control standpoint, if you think of version control, the change ID is like the revision ID, which we had already. The baselines and the snapshots are like tags. We're basically tagging the system at a given point. So we have these meaningful points where you can basically compare the two snapshots and see what has changed. And unlike the version history, where if you go to the history tab, you'll see field level changes, and it's very, very granular. At the baseline level, when you click on one of these things, you're going to see a much more aggregated set of changes. You will see these are all the artifacts that have changed in this baseline. Were they modified? Were they added? And were they deleted? And that lets you see what is the aggregate impact between all the changes made between this baseline and the one before it. And you can cycle through the baselines to see that. And also if relationships would change, you'll see that as well. And if you click on a particular item, you can then drill down one level further to see the individual history items that were changed as well. So that's what baselining is giving you. It's giving you essentially a way to create snapshots of the system, tag them to releases, and see everything that's changed. Now that's what we have today. Coming out in our next release will be the ability to track positional changes. So right now we can track all the field level changes that we do. So that's all the standard fields and all the custom fields. I think there's a question about that. That's actually the same as we've always done. The history tracker in Spira has done that since I think at least 2006. So that's not really a change. The baselining and the snapshots is new, but it's based upon the history tracking. The new things we're tracking now are the relationship changes that we never tracked before. And what will be available in the next version will be the positional changes. That's if you move a test step up or down. Someone said, I reordered the test step, or I changed the orders of these requirements scenario steps. There's no record of that. So the history will now show that, and the baseline tracker will show that. And the other thing will be, right now, we've got a lot of data available as grids. So you can see between baseline 1 and baseline 2, these are all the items that were changed. These are all the items that were added. These are all the relationships that were changed. But it's a big table. It's okay. So we want to add additional visualizations. So there's different ways of viewing this, more graphical forms and more intuitive forms to see lots of changes. So what we have right now is just the first step. The third and another very important piece will be, right now, if I go to a requirement, I can go to the history and see all the change which is made to it. I can go to the baseline tracker and I can see all the snapshots. We don't currently have this, but as part of this functionality will be, I also want to be able to view this requirement as how it looked at a certain baseline. So at the end of baseline 2, with all these changes that were made to the requirement or the test cases, I want to be able to switch the entire project to baseline 1 and be able to go back, and everywhere I click, that artifact will be displayed and the test coverage will be displayed and all of the fields would be displayed, read-only, of course, because it's historical. You'll be able to see how the artifact looks at that point. So those are some of the functions we're going to be adding in the future. We don't have these today. And in terms of additional visualizations, one of the things we're looking at is, can we leverage some of the work we're doing in the next version on source code management and reuse some of that for the baselining? For those who haven't seen any of the blogs we've written about the next version, version 6.7, it's got some major enhancements for source code. And if you look at the screen I'm showing you now, we're going to have inline code viewing and inline code diffing. So you'll be able to look at any line of code that's changed in the source code management section of Spira, and you'll be able to see either a side-by-side or a unified view. You'll see all the changes that were made. And it's a very nice graphical, clear way of seeing all the changes in the code. So one thing we're thinking of is, can we reuse this concept and show the artifacts the same way? So if I've changed a requirement or a test case, we could show all the fields as text and then do this textual diff, so you could see not just how the description has changed, which would be very useful, but even some of the structured fields could all be displayed in an inline diff view. So we're still trying to work out how we would do this. In its simplest form, we could have just the description fields, which are very large text. Instead of showing you the old value and the new value, which is not all that useful, we could show you the difference graphically, but it may be worth also taking some of the other structured fields, all the standard fields and all the custom fields, and turning them into a textual form so that we could show you a graphical diff. So that's another cool idea we're working on. What you're seeing here from the source code is coming out in the next version, in 6.7, next month, so you can look forward to that. Based on the feedback we get from that view, we may add it into other areas like the document tracking and also into the baselining functionality. We'll have a webinar on the new source code functionality in December or January, so don't worry about that. Okay, so that's the PowerPoint over. Let's look at the live application, because I think that's always more interesting than just some screenshots. So here is our sample system, and I'm in one of our sample projects over here. So let's go ahead and look at our ERP financial systems. This is a product in the system. It's one of the samples that comes with the tool. So if you want to sign up for a trial version, or if you have this sample project still in your live system, feel free to use it. or just create a new a new product which you can use. So go to administration. I'm logged in right now as a product admin and system admin, so I can create a new product or I can use an existing one. And I'm going to go into the product settings. And if you go to the main dashboard in the administration for a product, you will see right here it says baselines disabled. So this out of the box, this particular product, when you create it, will be disabled. When you create a new product going forward, you do have the option of turning baselining on or off at the point of creation. If you forget to do it, don't worry. Like this one, you can just go to the product details, click view details here, and then you can just simply go here and say baseline enabled, hit save. So if you have baselining disabled, what does that mean? Well, it means what will happen is you can't create baselines. It also means the only history being tracked will be the standard field changes. That's standard fields, custom fields. Those are always tracked regardless of the baseline setting. It means you can't create snapshots though, so everything you do in the system will be tagged with basically the initial baseline, which is we consider the start of project. And so once you turn on baselining, it lets you now create baseline snapshots is the first thing it lets you do. And the second thing it will do is it will now track associations that were not previously tracked. Okay, so let's go in. Now we've turned on baselining for this product. Let's go into it and let's look at the releases. We'll go over to releases. And let's work with this release 1.1, which is the next release that's currently active. There's currently active work on this. I'm not going to work at the patch level, but you could obviously do things there as well. So let's go in here and we'll see, look, we have this new baseline tab that's available, which is nice. And I'm going to create an initial baseline. So I'll just call it, the naming is up to you. Say we call it baseline 1.0. A short name like that, which is numerically useful, is often a good way to do it. And then this description would be more meaningful, like this is the initial if you have to spell though, initial snapshot for release 1.1. Baseline numbering is baselines are globally available in the admin, so you might decide that actually calling it baseline 1.0 is a bit complicated because you've got 1.1 as the release, so maybe that's not going to make sense. So we might want to call it baseline 1.1001. So that's something to think about. Make sure that when you're naming your baselines that they're going to be understandable. You can change the name later, so don't worry, but it is worth at least putting a bit of thought into it so that when you go back into the admin section, you'll see all the baselines for the entire product. If your release is numbered a certain way, it might be useful to number the baselines in a way that's compatible. So we'll add that baseline, which is now here. Great. So let's go ahead and pretend we're going to do some actual work in the system. Okay, so let's go ahead and add some requirements. So let's say we're going to add a new requirement into release 1.1 that is to do with the chart of accounts. This is an ERP system. So let's go ahead and go in here and say, okay, insert new requirement. You need to be able to rename a chart in the accounts list. So that could be a new requirement for our accounting system. And we're going to tag that with release 1.1. We'll say that's pretty high. We'll create another requirement. We do it right here, that's fine. You can edit and update. Well, so let's say you need to be able to delete a chart in the accounts list. Okay, that's another useful requirement. Oh, well, I forgot to change the priority. Let's change that. That's good. And I need some test cases for this. So let's go ahead and go ahead here and create some test cases. So tools, create test cases. I'm going to take a shortcut and create test cases directly from my requirement. Oh, and I also need to assign a release to this one because I forgot to do that. So we'll do that as well. Okay, so I've now made a few changes. Hit refresh. I've got my two new requirements. They've got test cases. That's why the gray bar. They're both assigned with the release. And I would now in real life go down to the test cases section and maybe we would make some changes to the test cases. So let's go ahead here. Let's go and add a couple of steps to this test case. We've got one step, the default one, by another step. Verify that you delete. That's good. Check that only the right user can do this delete. That might be a second step. Correctly. Okay, excellent. So now we'll go back to our release over here. And let's go ahead and create another baseline. New baseline. We'll call this baseline 1.1002. And this will be the baseline before we start doing testing. So we've written a requirement, we've written some test cases, baseline before we start doing testing. Could be, that might be where we're at. It's the next snapshot. Okay, now we'll go in here and we'll go to our test cases and we're going to go run the test case. Oh, and actually, yeah, that's fine. Actually, we'll add to a test set. So we'll even go ahead a bit further and we'll add a test set. Initial testing for release 1.1, that's fine. There we go. And then we'll go here and we will go tools, add to test set. Yep, add that. Okay, go to test sets. Let's run our test set. We'll hit next. And we'll pass the first one and we'll fail the second one. Fails with error. And we'll log a defect. Priority critical, hit fail. Okay, so we failed that one and we're done. Hit finish. We've now finished our testing. And we'll go back to our releases and we'll create our final baseline. Baseline 1.1003, end of initial testing. And again, it's a very simple example I've done here like that. So that's a very simple, we've got 3 snapshots of the system at different points in time during different activities. So now if we go over to administration, we can go to this new section that you see here called product baselines. If your product has baselining turned off, that you will not see this. So we go in here and we'll see we have 3 baselines. And the change IDs are showing you the different points in the system that was tagged with. So let's go ahead to the end of initial testing. This is the baseline that I created when I created it. It's an active baseline. That was a change ID. And you can see right here, I've got a very simple, rather than look through hundreds of different fields that you would do in the history, I can see, we created a new test set, and then we modified it. We've added a defect. We've modified these test cases, and we modified the release itself. And then if we go to the previous baseline, we'll see in this baseline, we added the test step, we added the modified a requirement, added test steps, added a test case, modified and added a requirement. We created a test step, another test step, and then we created another test case. So it's giving us here an aggregate set of what happened in each of these different snapshots. And if we go back to the very first baseline 001, that's the first baseline after product start. And so you're seeing the initial work we did, everything that was done in this entire product before we created baselines. So if you have a product that you already worked with and you turn on baselining, all the changes up until that point will all be listed between product start, which is effectively a virtual baseline that exists, and the very first actual baseline. So you'll see all your changes, which could be hundreds and thousands at the beginning, they'll all be tagged from the first baseline you created to this product start. So that's an important thing. So you may get to that very first baseline, we fill a lot of information, and that's just a way for this to create an initial a clean starting point. So the most important thing will be create that first baseline, and then everything you create in the subsequent baselines will be a set of snapshots. So that first one may not be as meaningful, and we'll just have everything done in the system up until that point, which if it's an existing product, obviously could be a lot of changes. So if we then look at this and we go, okay, let's have a look at these. what's in here. If we look at, let's say, the requirement, you can always click on any of these links here, and that will take you to a details page that will show you the history of what changed. So where it's an added item, it won't show that much. It will just say added. But if it's a modification type of action, you will see the fields that were changed in that modification. And so I said right now, it's very much grids and fields. We're going to be adding functionality to have more sophisticated graphical visualizations, but you can create these snapshots, see all the changes that were made, and then drill down on any change to see what actually happened. Okay, so now the other thing that's quite cool is then also the relationships. So let's go ahead back here, and let's go ahead and look at test cases. And let's say that the renaming, this is not really true, but let's say this renaming of a well, sort of semi-true, this renaming of a chart in our accounting, not only does it cover the new requirement we have, but it also covers the updating, because ultimately renaming is a kind of updating. So let's do that. So we're now going to have this test case cover an additional one. So we hit save, and maybe we go to releases and we add this release to another release. So we'll add to the first release like that. Okay. Okay. So now if we go back to our releases list, and we'll create another baseline. We'll call that baseline 1.1004. This will be snapshot after changing the test coverage. I mean, probably more likely do a lot more changes than just that, but that's just to show you. So that's that. Now we click on that baseline, and you can see here we've got the coverage changes. So that's a new change that we didn't have before. Before it would have not listed those because those have not changed. We didn't change the fields. We didn't change the descriptions. In a Spira test without baselining, you're not going to see those changes here. The fact we've added a release, we've added a requirement. Now, right now, the history details are still limited for these. We're going to be adding more functionality to show that. So right now, we only show you the fact that nothing has changed in terms of the old value and new value. You can see here it's an association add. So we do know that, but right now the reporting we have is relatively limited. This data is actually all being captured. So we're capturing behind the scenes that you've added an association from that test case to this release. If you go back to the list, oops, that's the wrong one. I went to the baseline list. If you go back to the baseline list and you click on this one here, it's the same thing. It's an association add. If I remove an association, if I go back and remove the association from that requirement, that'll be an association remove. So the great thing is we are capturing all of these changes now in the system and the history. And right now we don't show you the details of exactly what was added and removed. That's going to be coming as part of the next version. But we are tracking this. We're also, as I said, in the next version, also in addition, going to be tracking the positions. But right now we're tracking association changes. We're tracking field changes. And they're all going to appear in this baseline list. And and again, it can work the other way as well. So if we go back to requirements, and if I go back to my test coverage, and let me go back to this one here. Oops. And if I remove an association, so let's go ahead and remove it. And I go back to my baselines. I create another baseline. I should probably just keep this release open. I'm sorry. And go here and create baseline 1.1005. Removed test coverage that no longer applies. Hit add and go to that one. Hopefully, we'll see the fact that we removed the coverage. So if I click on this link to the change in the baseline, you'll see association remove, which is great. Now, again, right now, it's again a little bit limited. It doesn't show you exactly what in more detail what associations were changed. It just says that this requirement association was changed. that's going to be coming in the future, but we are tracking the data array to do all that. So we put a lot of emphasis into capturing the relationships in the same way that the next version we're going to be capturing the position moves, because once we have the data captured, and as you upgrade to version 6.6 and 6.1 and then 6.7, the great thing is all that's being captured. So as we add more functionality for the visualization side of things, all the data will already be in your system to support that. So our top priority was to capture the data first, so we can then we can improve the visualization once the data has been captured. So that's an overview of the baselining, and basically it lets you create snapshots in a product tied to a release, and between the different snapshot points you can see field changes, association changes, and in our next version you'll be able to see position changes. So that's what we have today for this webinar. As I mentioned, we'll be having more webinars on some of the other functionality coming around source code and in the future. Great. Well, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. I hope it was useful. We will be making a recording available on our website, and also there is another session of this next week for those who couldn't make it in the morning, for those in Europe and or people who get up earlier. So feel free to share that as well. And if anything comes up, any questions you have that were not here, feel free to email us. Email our support team, reach out to our customer success manager, or post questions on our social channels. There's many ways to get hold of us. So thanks again for attending today's webinar. I hope it was helpful. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and I hope we see you on a future Spira or Appease webinar from Inflectra. Have a great day.